Greetings, you happily miserable accursed. We've got various political shitstorms to cover in today's pod, so we're going to get right to it. However, one programming note. Our regular panel is down a Corey this week. He's flown home to deal with a family issue, so we're all sending him positive vibes and wish him the best. Good luck, Corey. Guesting for Corey is one of our favorites, the ever insightful Lisa Raitt. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, David. Thank you for saying that.
And as always, Jordan Leichnitz and Scott Reid are here with us. And now on to the shitstorms. The fall economic statement fallout. Poilievre delivers a sharp speech at the Empire Club. Singh's getting more and more aggressive on his economic messaging. How are the parties positioning on the economy? Doug Ford is flooding the zone. In less than a week, he's invoked the notwithstanding clause to impose a deal on education workers, flipped on his promise not to touch Greenbelt lands, and overruled Hamilton City Council on freezing its urban boundary. What's the broad PC strategy here? And is any of this going to hurt him? Our cursed clipping is Chantal Hébert's piece in The Star on the potential collateral constitutional damage Doug Ford may be causing with his labor war. And of course, we'll close the show with Gordon Pinsent and our Hey Yous. Lisa, Scott, Jordan, great to have you here. Lisa, thank you for pinch hitting.
No, my pleasure. No one can replace Corey, though.
Well, yes, you are, and you're going to be fantastic. But Corey is really, really good. Hey, yes. You folks, have you been watching a TV show called The Bear? I got into the show called The Bear. It's really good. It's on Disney Plus. You should find it.
Love Disney Plus.
Oh, bad news. I had to sit the children down. And I made them sell one of every pair of shoes that they have, and we dumped Disney Plus. As times are tough.
I was gonna say, forget labor disruption. If you really want to make parents mad, talk to them about cutting Disney Plus. That's that's the next level right there.
I mean, it's the Marvel universe. Like, honestly, that's a lot. That's a big stretch in our house.
It's Moon Knight's fault. That show got so strange. I think that Christopher Phelan just said, "Listen, we got to cut somewhere," and it's.
And if I have to watch a kid's show that isn't Bluey, I don't know what's going to happen. That's some quality programming right there.
Mm.
Anyway, on to Ford. So we're taping at 9:30, and Ford has just spoken, and we don't really have all the fallout from it. But he's announced that he would withdraw his legislation and withdraw the use of Section 33, the notwithstanding clause of the Charter, if QP goes back to the bargaining table. And he offered to be generous with them. So this is a new piece in a context of what looked like a Ford Fiesta. They were taking advantage of a big controversy that they had over QP to sneak in some other things, like flipping on the Greenbelt, the promise not to touch the Greenbelt, getting involved in Hamilton, like I said, all of which seemed to be, hey, we got a big thing going. We can slip these things under the radar. Who's going to pay attention to the Greenbelt issue with this other thing going on? But it really, Ford's statement today is an indication that they don't feel this is going well for them. So, Lisa, what's your take on what the Ford government strategy was? Why did they decide to take this approach, and how is it going for them?
I think the strategy was guided by one premise, and that is the kids have to stay in school. I think they got a lot of crap over the COVID shutdowns, and other jurisdictions let the kids stay in school. And I think that they were just really seized with the notion that the kids have to be able to go, and that they were going to use every tool that they had in order to stop the schools from closing down and sending the kids home. They thought that the outcry from the parents about this situation would be firmly in their favor, and therefore they brought out the big stick. By the way, I know, Scott, that you're exercised about. I'm not exercised about them using the big stick. I think it's there to be used. I think the federal government has their own power to deal with it as well, and they can all have a constitutional bun fight, but it's there to be used. What I find interesting is that in the past, your utilization of that, your breach of the Ethics Act, there's one other thing too, that use of the notwithstanding clause, breach of the Ethics Act, and there's one more, I'll think about it in a second. Those things were always left by the politicians to the public to decide whether or not they want to throw the bums out. So if you get it wrong, then they're going to get rid of the government. And we see that people don't care anymore. Like sorry to say, yes, we're seeing uprisings. Does it matter in the vote? I know, Scott, you want it to matter in the next vote. I don't know if it matters in the next vote. Will remain to be seen. But when politicians leave it to the electorate, for me, it was like the third rail when I was a Harper cabinet minister. My God, you breached the Ethics Act. That's it. You're done. You're never going to get elected and your life is over. It would appear not so much.
Scott, what do you think?
Well, a couple things. I'm going to come back to Lisa's point because I want to start actually with what I think is going on overall. What I think going on overall, and I'll start with the climb down. What appears to be a climb down on the part of the Ford government, at least a retreat. It's clearly a retreat, which tells us that the one public poll that says that the government's being blamed for this disproportionately by the public must be echoed by their own internal polling. They wouldn't turn tail unless they thought that this was causing them political discomfort. I think it's and you combine it with the points you're making about the green belt, and it's a reminder that a majority, and all of us in politics need these reminders every once in a while. It's a reminder that a majority government is not licensed to do what you can and when you want to. Like there are still limits that are reasonable on you, that the public can rise up, that discomfort and pain can be exerted against you. And so I look at it and I sort of see it's a government that is saying, we want to do these things. We want to use the notwithstanding clause. We want to impose the contract, use the notwithstanding clause as a demonstration of our power. That will set the tone for the teachers union. That will set the tone with other public sector unions. That will be popular with our base, but it will also show those we're bargaining with that we're not going to fuck around. And I think you can sometimes overthink these things. I think you can satisfy yourself. We're in our first year of a re-elected term. We've got a full 4 years to go. We don't have any check on ourselves. As long as we just keep our shoulders squared, we don't have anything to worry about. But there are still limits. People can say, too much, stop it. And I think that's what the story of this morning is.
Just because it's early in the term, Scott, Kathleen Wynne sold Hydro One in the first year of her term.
Yeah, I was there. That's what I'm saying is that, so I just think it is a sobering reminder that you can overplay your hand, that you can say, I'm in my first year. I have these tools available to me. I'm willing to break norms because I have a different point of view. We've been arguing back and forth with Corey off camera. He has a different view in the notwithstanding clause. He has a much more traditional, small c conservative view, which is, I think Parliament ought to reign supreme. Piss on the charter. I shouldn't say that. I don't want to, he's not saying piss on the charter, but he's saying that he is, and there's a legitimate school of thought that feels this way. He's saying, I don't care as much about the charter as I do about the supremacy of Parliament. And we're therefore not bound by the same, norms that you are with respect to its the use of Section 33. So, all of those things, but you're still subject to the public. And I think that this is a sobering reminder. The second thing I would say is that, I do think it's, and we'll get to this, I guess, with Chantel's piece, but I think it's the point you're making, Lisa, ethics violations, use of notwithstanding clause.
Emergencies Act is the third. The three things that you would never think anyone would use.
Well, I mean, some of those things are circumstantial, some of those things aren't. But the fundamental point is, in broad strokes, and we're going to have U.S. midterms this Tuesday. I think we're watching. Just because we can observe that these things are no longer a third rail, that doesn't mean it's to be celebrated and imitated. I mean, I think the erosion of norms and constraints and the impulse to say, I better check myself before I wreck myself, that's a bad thing, not a good thing. And I think in particular, the use of the notwithstanding clause, if you're going to override people's constitutional rights, knowingly do so, you better have absolutely no other tools left available. You better have demonstrated that it's the only option available to you and that you've been driven to that point, not that you've driven yourself there as a matter of political option.
Hey, Jordan, can you parse this for me? The pushback from the public against this move on the education workers, is it a reaction to the use of the notwithstanding clause? Is it a reaction to a perceived attack on education, or is it a reaction to these particular largely poorly paid employees? What is the trigger point here?
Yeah, I think it's mostly the third. I think the Ford government overreached in choosing the wrong target here. They went after the lowest paid, sort of it's the most, even if you're not broadly sympathetic to public unions, it is a part of the education system that most families interact with. They know people who are ECEs. They know people who are in these jobs. They know the value they bring to the education system. And frankly, I think everybody can look at it on the face of it and say 39,000 or, whatever is inadequate. And so I think that their thinking was much more along the lines of what Scott was saying, which is that they were going to use this test case to send a message to other unions. And also, I think that they are really doing an interesting thing where they're trying to separate private sector unions from public sector unions and create a bit of a culture war there between white collar workers and blue collar workers. And so the idea being that if you're in a public sector union, you're one of these workers, you have a pension, you've got all these, I'm doing air quotes here for our listeners, all these cushy benefits. That somehow you're less deserving of a fair negotiating process or a wage increase. And I think they just miscalculated. I think people just look on the face of that and say that that's unfair. They know the conditions that these folks are working in, and it blew back on them.
Mm.
We have some robust climate action goals in this country. That's as it should be. But as we talked about last week, just like our G7 cousins, digital policy currently isn't featured in our climate policy thinking. There are no call-outs about expanded digital connectivity or continuing digital innovation in how we meet our GHG reduction targets. That just seems incomprehensible to me, Hurly-Burleyites, because digital tools are critical in the fight against climate change. To wit, a recent independent report from Farpoint says that by focusing on expanding digital access and adoption with the right policies, we can reduce GHG emissions by up to 20%, 40 to 60% of our Paris targets. But on behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS, I think it's time we take this conversation from the theoretical to some very practical outcomes. Think about the delivery of public services like healthcare. Stronger digital connectivity means we can take more and different kinds of appointments in our homes, transfer high-definition files like test results quickly and more efficiently, even have surgeons in one part of the country participate in procedures in another part of the country without hopping on a plane. 5G-enabled tech and information sharing is going to help GHG-intensive industries like agriculture and mining get their products out of the ground through the stakeholder supply chain and to their markets with greater speed and far less waste. Remote, Indigenous, and underserved communities will be able to work, operate their businesses, and access so many more critical services than they do right now at home. The point of it all? Digital policy as climate policy means that every individual Canadian and our largest organizations will avoid emitting a substantial amount of carbon. Fully embracing it means we'll not only be able to reach our climate targets, we can lead the entire G7 in climate action. To learn more about it and to support this kind of thinking, go to telus.com/digital policy for climate. Lisa, what do you think? What do you think would have been the reaction had they not used the notwithstanding clause? The same or different?
Different. You wouldn't have gotten Leuna and Unifor involved. And I think Joe Mancinelli called Doug Ford on the weekend and said, dude, like seriously, you just picked the wrong fight and I have to come after you because I have no choice. They won the right to strike in 2015 via the Supreme Court. They will protect that to the end of time. That's a significant win. It turned 40 years of jurisprudence on its head. And that's great. I mean, I can understand why they brought the notwithstanding clause. I think Jordan is exactly correct. What a terrible example to do it on, though. You know, when you have the facts, run with the facts. When you have the law, run with the law. They did not have the facts on this one, and they didn't have the law, really. So it's kind of awkward. And I wish I'd watched the press conference, to be honest, but because I can only imagine the look on poor Stephen Lecce's face standing behind the premier after coming out with fire and brimstone, and now suddenly in the background while Doug talks about the fact that we want to walk away a little bit from the table.
And I would also add, bless Ford and Lecce, they've done more to energize and unify the labor movement across Canada.
I did pretty good.
You were good.
pretty good. Come on. We lost the 2015 election.
That is true.
Hold my beer, says Lisa.
I feel like you passed your beer to Leichnitz and Ford at this point. This is like serious talk of a general strike for the first time in a very long time. Yeah. You've got Unifor pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into they are healing rifts. They are bringing people together, and I think they're proving the old labor adage: there is no such thing as an illegal strike, just an unsuccessful one, right? So now we are at a place where if the unions are able to tee this up into a political win, then they have a win.
But I think he's flipped the corner, Jordan. Just to stick with you for a second, he's lobbed the ball back. Does CUPE take his offer?
Yeah, I think CUPE at this point, the last that I saw, they were saying they just want to get back to the table. So I think, it's hard to say, it's unfolding right now, but I think that they made another offer that Leichnitz didn't. They'd be boxed
if they didn't, right? They'd lose a lot of momentum.
They've made a couple offers now, and I think that they don't have a legal solution at this point, right? With the use of the notwithstanding clause, the only path available to them now is a political solution. And I think they have flexed a muscle here that we haven't seen in a while, and it was effective. And at the end of the day, if Ford wants to fuck around with labor peace, he's going to find out, and he did.
Here's the hardest. Yeah, I don't get the logic on this. So you're sitting down and you're trying to figure out how you're going to deal with this. So one side of me says, okay, let them go out on strike and let the public blame, right? Let the public blame the education workers. But obviously they were worried that the public wouldn't blame the education workers. So they came in with a notwithstanding clause, which assured you that they would not blame the education workers. And I just don't get the logic that was at play in the strategic sessions, unless somebody just wants to take a run at the public sector and test this notwithstanding clause. And if that's the case, you reap what you sow, man.
Well, one of the hardest things, hang on, I want to say, I'm really, really hot on this issue because we don't know where CUPE is going to go at the time that we're recording this. And so I want to say this, knowing that we don't know what they'll say. But one of the toughest things in politics is to spot a loss coming. The Ford government failed to do that. It failed to see that the use of the notwithstanding clause would rally all public and private sector unions to the same side, blow up their coalition, probably place doubts in the mind of the public, and put them in a spot where they were going to start at being blamed by the public for having this labor strife. And then we all know that it only gets worse as strife goes on because people say, I don't care who's to blame. I just want the government to fix it. But the second toughest thing in politics is to spot a win. And I think that CUPE would be making a gigantic error if it right now, it had a 10 a.m. news conference scheduled. Cancel the goddamn news conference. Get a cup of coffee. Put yourselves
to 11.
Good. I would postpone it to 1. Just take a fucking breath. Think this thing through. Make sure you don't say, you know what, we got the wind at our sails. He hasn't promised to forever relinquish the use of the notwithstanding clause. He hasn't promised this and this and this. No, don't outsmart yourself. Take this as a win, declare it a win, shape it as a win, get back to the table and reserve the right to bring holy hell back on top of the government if you determine that they're reneging on their good faith, on a promise to be good faith. But boy, oh boy, do not mistake this win for something other than a win. Claim it, declare it, wear it, and do it proudly.
Well, I don't know what this means, but CUPE Ontario just tweeted out, pressure works, let's keep going.
I just think that's a terrible, 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 terrible misjudgment. They will reverse the onus on themselves. The public, all the parents who are stuck dealing with childcare will say, wait a moment, the goddamn premier was wrong and he admitted it and he walked it back. And now the unions are saying they're going to keep our schools closed. It will put all of the public anger right back on them, and it will divide the private sector unions back on the public sector. It's just, they'll lose every advantage they gained over the last 72 hours.
Lisa?
So these things are orchestrated to some extent, right? It should be orchestrated. Surely to God, somebody said to the premier, if you go out and you do this today, CUPE is going to come back to the table. Otherwise, why would you go out and beg into the void, not knowing what's going to be the outcome?
Well, he shifts the onus, doesn't he? As Scott just said, he shifts the onus, I think.
Yeah, I still wouldn't do it unless I had an assurance that there's somebody on the other side who's going to come back to the table.
Yeah, but But you think that he's doing it as a play. I think and maybe it is a play, but I think he's doing it fundamentally because his ass is on fire. And what do? You pour water on it.
It's his way out, though, right? This is his way out, and he needs to have it accepted as a win. Otherwise, he's looking very weak.
I don't think so.
Scott, I was super interested in the flood the zone thing that they did, though. Like the green belt thing, I presume they had not intended to make that green belt announcement when they made it, but they saw an opportunity to make it because all of the media, all of the public was preoccupied with this thing, so they could slide the green belt in without the kind of scrutiny that kind of decision would normally get. That's pretty clever, isn't it?
I don't think so. I don't think. I know there's this kind of comms 101 school, which is drop it at 4:00 on a Friday in the middle of chaos. It gets less attention than it otherwise would, and reporters have a hard time surfacing it. And maybe that's all true, but to people that are paying attention, it's obvious what you're doing. I think it actually undermines you. And I mean, when it comes to an issue like the Greenbelt and carving up 15 parcels of land, I think it only sends a signal that you must be ashamed of it. Otherwise, you wouldn't seek to hide it. And that's just an invitation for people to scrutinize it. That means they're going to scrutinize which developers are going to benefit, how much they contributed, what lobbyists they hired, how all this worked. And I'll tell you something else, David.
Scott? Who's going to do that? There's no fucking media. Like the 5 people that work in the media in Ontario are covering the goddamn CUPE thing.
I'll make a prediction right now, David. This is the kind of thing. If it's not this thing, it will be this kind of thing that actually puts this government into a genuinely severe crisis, a scandal crisis. I think it is going to be the connection between deep-pocketed contributors, lobbyists who are wired into the premier's office, and government actions that are taken but not necessarily trumpeted and tried to slide past folks. That little loop is going to, at one point, rear itself, and I think it's going to cause some real damage and probably take some careers down with it.
So here's a bit of news. In October, our sponsor CN moved a record-breaking amount of grain out of Western Canada to market. Let me repeat that. Never before has CN moved that much grain in a month. 3.23 million tons. That's a nice brag to be able to make, and it's very good news for our grain producers, some of whom feared the railways might not be able to move their crops smoothly, efficiently, and on time this year. The fact is, CN's back-to-basics approach, its insistence that trains leave and connect on time, has dramatically increased the railway's velocity. CN is turning and burning, as they say in the business, and racking up results. But, yes, there's always a but. Not everything in the supply chain is operating as efficiently. In the Port of Vancouver, grain export terminals, and I should note here that railways do not own or operate these terminals, have been struggling to keep up. Part of the reason is rain. It's been pouring rain in Vancouver lately. The atmospheric rivers are back, and the grain terminals have had to severely restrict transfer of grain onto ships for the voyage to foreign markets. To put it simply, grain can't get wet. You can imagine what would happen to wet grain sitting in a cargo hold for 30 days at sea. It would arrive as porridge. But for a whole lot of reasons, no one has yet figured out how to efficiently load grain onto boats in the rain. And when terminals can't load ships, everything backs up. At one point last month, CN had 18 trains loaded with grain headed toward Vancouver and had to hit their pause buttons because of issues in Vancouver. As I said last week, we absolutely need more terminal and container capacity, especially in our West Coast ports, and find a solution to grain in the rain, because it's called a supply chain for a reason. The links all have to work. Cargo has to move. All right, okay, so Jordan suggested our clipping of the week, which plays off this. It was Chantal Hébert in the Toronto Star this past week writing about the Ford government's use of the notwithstanding clause. And I'll just got a few quick excerpts here. Under the guise of a controversial back-to-work legislation, Ontario Premier Doug Ford has thrown a constitutional grenade at Canada's collective bargaining process this week. The collateral damage that will result from Ontario's decision to suspend the constitutional rights of the province's education workers is poised to extend well beyond the province and its school system. She then goes on to say the federal government has 2 alternative paths, neither of which is risk-free. The first would see the federal government refer the issue of a preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause to the Supreme Court for an opinion about whether the provinces are outside the lines. The other option would see the federal government reach deep in its constitutional toolbox for the sledgehammer of the disallowance power, which allows the federal government to disallow a provincial law. But because it is considered a weapon of political mass destruction, it has not been used in more than 7 decades. By design or accident, Ford has brought Canada closer to a unity crisis than it has been for almost 3 decades. In an ideal world, cooler heads than those involved in the Queen's Park move would prevail on Parliament Hill. So, Jordan, what did you find interesting about that?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that Chantel's analysis of the paths out for the Trudeau government were interesting. I'm obviously not a constitutional scholar. I would not be on the show with you if I was. But, my understanding is that,
wait a second.
Unless you have a few.
We're pretty erudite. We could handle that kind of show.
We don't allow experts of any kind on this show.
That's right. Hot air only. But my understanding is that disallowance, basically by virtue of having been not used for so long, is not really a functional option. So I was interested in Chantel's, suggestion of the reference to the Supreme Court to provide guardrails for future provincial uses of the notwithstanding. And I found that to be a bit of an elegant solution for Trudeau, because it also allows the federal government to weigh in on the pieces that are impacting Quebec without actually weighing in on the pieces that are impacting Quebec, which has been, of course, a bit of an awkward pickle for all federal parties. I do think that Chantel is right to name that picking the fight between Ford and the federal government is the worst possible combination. That this is not a good mix. And I think in particular, the fact that what we're seeing is this is the second test that Ford has had with a notwithstanding clause. So I think a little bit of the thinking in his office goes that we used it around the fundraising and the elections legislation, and that went fine for us. So we're gonna do it again here. And that, that's dangerous, right? I think that kind of trial ballooning is not where we ultimately want to go with this. So if Trudeau is looking for an out, which I think he should be at this point, it's becoming a little bit awkward that, he's tried nothing and nothing has happened. So if he's looking to do something, I think this is one that he may end up choosing.
I really love Chantal Hébert. I think she's one of the jewels of Canadian democracy. She's been a really great writer and truth teller as she sees it all of her career. But I was outraged when I read this, that she wrote it almost as if the Legault government didn't fucking exist. And to me, what Ford is doing in Ontario, what Smith and Moe are doing in Alberta and Saskatchewan, is all a direct outgrowth of the federal government's unwillingness to step up and stop Quebec. And so everybody else looks around and says, well, there's no fucking rules for them. Why are there any rules for us? Why are we having to play by these Marquess of Queensbury rules when they're bare knuckle fighting? And so, to me, this all starts with Trudeau getting serious with Legault on the notwithstanding clause. Quebec has used this preemptively ever since it was put in place, the charter, right? Mm-hmm. So
for a brief period on every single piece of legislation.
Right. Mm-hmm. So at some point, isn't it reasonable for Ford to say, well, what the fuck?
Well, I think that's probably what he said in the conversation with Trudeau when Trudeau called him. But look, conservatives fundamentally believe that laws should be made by lawmakers and that Parliament has supremacy. So it's not a surprise to see somebody like Legault or somebody like Ford or Moe or Brad Wall, who started it all out, thinking, I don't think that the Supreme Court justices got it right. I think people make laws, therefore I'm going to use the notwithstanding clause. And then if the people disagreed with me, the people will throw me out of office. And I think that's exactly what the calculus is. And why you're seeing it happening so much is because most of the provinces are conservative right now. And Legault is getting away with it on something as fundamental as religious freedom. Yes, right to strike isn't fundamental, but you only had it since 2015. You have had freedom of religion for a hell of a long time. And it's impacting, and the fighting is from Muslim women. That's who's fighting it more so than anybody else. And now the fight is for public sector unions and private unions, and therefore Trudeau's in there like a dirty shirt. So yeah, I agree with your analysis. It's a little bit too much for me to hear. It's rich. It's a bit rich, right? Is like to say that we're ignoring that. And I heard Tom Mulcair say exactly the same thing. Where are you on this? It's been going on for years.
One, I think that Legault's these things are all bad. Obviously, any use of the notwithstanding clause, in my view, probably signals a government that is willing to override constitutional rights of individuals and groups, and that's a bad thing, period. But I think they're not, all these things are necessarily created equal, and arguably Legault's use of the notwithstanding clause is worse than that, than the purpose for which it's been utilized by the others, because it is about trampling on a set of minority rights, which I think is truly reprehensible.
All parties, you're right.
And that's right. Yeah. So and I understand how complicated and uncomfortable it is federally when we're in a perpetual 33% world to run against the grain of Quebec politics and risk that you will never be able to get to a majority, or worse yet, might actually lose your minority. But you got to figure out what you are and what you aren't willing to fight for, and what you're willing to lose over. And I just think that when you look at this issue, nothing but badness comes from failing to speak up and speak out. And I agree with David 1,000%. The reason that we see the likes of Danielle Smith and Scott Moe emboldened is because they know that Quebec does. They employ that as the preamble to their argument, right? If it's good enough for Quebec, it's good enough for us, and we just dare you to try to stop. And yes, Trudeau is going to be accused of being a hypocrite when he speaks out in the example of Ontario. And yes, he'll be accused of being divisive and anti-West and all of those things when he speaks out when it's employed, or for similar arguments around autonomy in the West. But I would rather have somebody who comes to the table and identifies the national ideal and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms late than someone who does it never. So, I don't think this fight can be avoided now. And it's gotta be waged.
They can't take an asymmetrical approach to it, Scott, can they?
They can't. No, they can't, I think. And that's the challenge. This thing is going to get very ugly. I do think they can, and we've talked about this in the context of fiscal federalism, where the stakes are high but not as high, where the issues are important but not as emotional. But I do think they can create a dynamic where not all of the provinces are lined up against the City Hall of Ottawa. You can have cross-cutting interests on this stuff. And so I think, if Danielle Smith wants to blow up, as an example, pensions, which is part of her fair share argument, she wants to blow up the idea of a national public pension. Well, I think other provinces will have something to say about that. And I think that you might want to unleash some of those cross-cutting stresses if you're Trudeau. But all of it is playing with matches, to be clear. But we are in this world now. And that's why Chantel's observation is correct, because once it moved out of the asymmetric world of let's just leave Quebec to itself and became a national issue, then the federal government has no choice. The national government has no choice but to speak up with a national voice. And that's going to take us right into this ugly discussion.
So, you're fast becoming expert on some of the issues surrounding Canada's shipping container capacity. Maybe not what you expected when you came to this podcast, but hey, knowledge is cool. What you learned in our first ad from our sponsor, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, is that we don't have enough of it. Capacity, I mean. And that we're all feeling the impact of increasing supply chain challenges. So, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority is proposing to build a brand new marine terminal for shipping containers at the Port of Vancouver. Roberts Bank Terminal 2 is the official name for it. Because business and trade needs will continue to grow in Canada, and these marine container terminals link our businesses, large and small, to the global economy. Otherwise, as our ports continue to fill, and at the Port of Vancouver, that's where this is heading fast, Canadian businesses and our trade partners will look to U.S. ports to move their products, which means they might even have to truck them to and from Canada. One, that's a blow to our nation's trade sovereignty. And two, when lack of container capacity combines with that kind of inefficiency, costs go up. Either they're absorbed by our businesses, many of them small or mid-sized, or passed on to the customer in the form of higher prices. Neither is a good option, especially in an inflationary environment like this. I mean, why make a bad thing worse when you don't have to? Building Roberts Bank Terminal 2 will bring another container terminal operator to the Port of Vancouver. That means more competition to help make the cost of goods more affordable for Canadians, a stronger supply chain, more of that critical capacity I talked about, and protecting trade sovereignty for Canada. And frankly, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority is a trusted partner of government, business, Indigenous groups, and local communities to get it all done.
But politically, there's also a really interesting challenge, right? Which is that the whole premise of the notwithstanding clause was that its use would be limited because there would be a political price to pay. And I think that what we have seen is that there is not really, generally speaking, a large political price to pay for its use. So for Trudeau, like that's a circle he's got to square. How do you contain that? How do you corral that when really like the whole premise that set it up around public opinion is not proving to be true at this particular moment in time?
Are we sure?
Lisa,
that should
can I
we
have
take
a quick argument with you and your conservative viewpoint? Here's my point of view about the Charter, and I just need, it's my show, so I'm going to say this because I feel really strongly about it, which is the Canadian Charter of Rights is already unique, certainly unique from the American Charter, in that it has something called Section 1. And Section 1 says, none of the rights in here are absolute. All of these things are subject to reasonable limitations that can be justified in a free and democratic society. So that already exists. So you could pass back to work legislation if you can justify it in the public interest, right? And that it's a reasonable limitation. Mm-hmm. So when you use Section 33, the notwithstanding clause, what you're really saying is we're taking a measure that we don't believe we could convince a court is a reasonable limitation on a right in a free and democratic society. So on what basis do you do that?
When you don't believe that the court is going to find reasonableness in your argument, you take the bigger hammer because you fundamentally believe that laws are remade by lawmakers and not, and this is not my quote, this is how it's said out there, activist judiciary, 7 of which, of course, were appointed by Stephen Harper. I get it, but that is the reality. That's how people think. Unelected judges should not be the ones that are figuring out new rights as they come along that were not originally, or expanding or incorporating new pieces in. And they just decided that the notwithstanding clauses, Brad Wall used notwithstanding originally on back to work legislation long ago. He did it early 2000s, and it made its way through the court. And he was found, obviously, that was the reference that ended up giving right to strike. But for Ford et al., there obviously is some people within that group who think fundamentally that the only path forward was to invoke notwithstanding and that there would be no repercussions, that people would be on side. And they're not. But the question that Jordan put is eloquently is, what is the political price? And as I said at the top, I believe there is none.
But, can I offer a counterpoint?
One of the reasons the notwithstanding clause exists is because Alan Blakeney pushed very, very hard for it.
He did.
And one of the reasons why Alan Blakeney pushed very, very hard for it is he thought the charter might be used to undermine collective bargaining rights. And that the individual rights might come to supersede collective rights. And therefore, he wanted to be able to use notwithstanding to preserve collective bargaining rights. Have I got that right, Jordan?
That's exactly right. Yep.
Yeah.
We're commenting on this stuff as it's unfolding in real time. We haven't even heard from QP yet. Ford's words have barely escaped his mouth for less than an hour. I guess I would just caution us. I mean, we can get into an argument about, unelected judiciary and majoritarianism and the trampling of individual rights. And if you don't think that Section 1 is going to protect your legislation, then maybe that's a clue that what you're doing is actually abusive. But set all that aside, we're not a constitutional law forum here. On the politics of it, and to Jordan's question, which is just dynamite, isn't there a hint in the course of events for the past 5 weeks and the past 2 hours that maybe actually there are political consequences of using Section 33? Like, it seems to me that without the notwithstanding clause, not as many Ontarians, as disinterested and low voter information as they are and all detached from it, not as many of them would have concluded that it was the government that was being heavy-handed, and it was for them that they must direct most of their anger and blame for this happening. And it would not have rallied the private sector unions on that fundamental point of principle around collective bargaining rights to the side of CUPE and the public sector unions. I guess I just look at it and I go, are the people rising out of their houses and saying protect the pristine use of notwithstanding clause only in the most extreme circumstances? No. But I think you can argue that its use triggered a set of events that had real political consequences and resulted in Ford having to swallow himself.
It made the action look much more extraordinary and therefore drew much more attention to it. And why would you use it against these people, right? It seemed bullying almost, right?
Well, that's where I'm at. So I think it's going to be a fundamental factor in the next election 3.5 years from now? Probably not. But I don't know that we can conclude that it had no political consequence.
They're all bricks in the wall.
Just to add to that, I think that something that's so important to watch on this is that the overreach has, I think, created potentially a much more dangerous and longer lasting political problem for Doug Ford, which is that he went after workers. He went after low paid workers in the middle of an affordability crisis. He was talking, he is talking about taking money away from basically the working poor here. And this is not a great brand. And the problem is that it, when you do stuff like this on repeat, it can confirm a story or suspicions that people have about you. And I think here is where we see the ideology, perhaps not of Ford himself, but perhaps of the people around him, tripping into some of his greatest political assets, which is his ability to connect to working class voters. But right here, what he's doing, that attempting to wedge apart private sector and public sector, it did not work. They tightened up, that held. And I think that it leaves Canadians, or Ontarians rather, and average people who work for a paycheck wondering, who's next, right? And we know, Corey's not here to talk about it, but he's been very clear, teachers are next. Well, I'm not sure that's sitting right with people. And I think for me, that's the piece that I find really interesting, that what triggered a response was something that was around really affordability, pocketbook, and trying to divide working people against one another. And it didn't work.
All right, Chantel, thanks for triggering such a vigorous discussion. With apologies to Maurice and the boys, do you remember the second last month, November? My riders this year, just pretenders. The Grey Cup a dream away. November for me is the quintessential Canadian month. Grey Cup is one reason. Another is that it's Diabetes Awareness Month. We've taken a well-deserved measure of national pride in the discovery of insulin, but that was, get ready for it, over a century ago. So on behalf of our sponsor, Diabetes Canada, these are the sobering facts. Diabetes and prediabetes takes a lifelong mental and physical toll on more than 11.7 million people in this country. 1 out of every 3 people in Canada. It costs our healthcare system almost $50 million each day to treat diabetes and its complications. Staggering, really. So it's fantastic that federal government has just tabled the framework for diabetes. Diabetes Canada is on a mission to end diabetes. The tabling of the framework is an important step. But now it's time to implement the framework in 5 key ways. Provide adequate resources so that our communities have access to the supports, medications, and devices for everyone. Measure our progress to create ultimate accountability for every action that's taken. Get better data. That means scaling up and creating new data connection points, as well as increasing the sharing of that data so that we improve how people live. Fund education programs to improve our understanding with tools that are inclusive, culturally appropriate, patient-focused, and work to reduce stigma. Advance creative and impactful research to emphasize innovation in the treatment and management of diabetes and its impact on marginalized communities. It all adds up to millions of lives and billions of taxpayer dollars saved. Diabetes Canada reminds you that November is an excellent time to consider these priorities, and Budget 2023 next spring, the critical time to implement them. We got time now to just get to one last thing, which is This past week was the fall economic statement delivered by Finance Minister Freeland. If you don't know what was in it, go listen to another podcast. She did some interviews afterwards to promote the fall economic statement. Poilievre went to Toronto and did a speech to the Empire Club, which is the kind of event he's not been doing as leader. Interesting. Went and did a speech to the Empire Club on what his approach was. Had apparently a pretty good crowd in downtown Toronto. And, you know, for all of our trashing of Jagmeet Singh over the months and years for not being on this, he's on it now. And he's got his own point of view, and he's pushing it aggressively on social media. Scott, what are the various messages, and who has their finger on the zeitgeist here?
Well, I think the distinction I see between the economic statement, therefore the Liberals, and the other two parties and their messages coming from their leaders is that the Liberal message is almost a pause. We are going to pursue a course of relative fiscal rectitude for now. To be updated and potentially reversed, altered come March, April, whenever there's a budget. So it's a holding statement in many respects, because I don't know that they're arguing that as a matter of principle they won't spend. They're simply saying until, like the minister literally said, she was transparent about this. She said, we're keeping our powder dry, which is to imply that we may have to actually turn the taps on. I'm mixing my metaphors. I think the others have jumped on the cost of living crisis with effect. And, Singh is now talking kitchen table economics and talking about the consequences in people's real lives. That's an effective critique. The same for Poilievre. Poilievre added to that, I think, almost a classic Reagan-esque prescription, right? What are his answers? His answers are deregulation and lower taxes across the board. I didn't see much else in that, and that may be all that you're looking for. And certainly it's stripped free of all the kind of crazy online convoy, lunacy, vaccine mandate stuff. So maybe that's good for all his constituency. I think the real question is going to be, when is the next election, and will inflation be over? Because, if we fight the election and it's 7% inflation and added to that are recessionary pressures and people are feeling beleaguered, then the government's going to be in tough shape. But if it's 3 years from now or 2.5 years from now, and inflation is at 1.9%, and we are on the upswing coming out of what was a relatively shallow and short recession, then that may be a whole new ballgame. And none of these messages that we're hearing from Poilievre and Singh might be the messages that they have to utilize in order to win votes in the next election campaign. So, it really comes back to that word that was so volcanic 6 months ago, transitory. Are our current economic circumstances transitory? If not, then the Liberals are in gigantic trouble. If they are, then we're going to see a whole new script and a whole new zeitgeist.
Inflation's bad politics, but recessions are worse politics. I'd definitely rather be running an election campaign in an inflationary environment than in a recessionary environment. And so a lot of it depends on, I think, Scott, on how bad the recession is. Because, the recession of the early 80s was well over by the time that Liberals went to the polls in 84, and they still got smoked. And the recession of the early 90s was well over by the time the Conservatives went to the polls, and they got smoked. If you govern through a really bad recession, I don't think people forget it.
That's a good point. Economic indicators aren't the only thing that lag. So are people's perceptions. They lag also, right, politically.
Yeah. Lisa, what do you think about what's going on in the banter between the parties about the economy?
So I was at the Pierre Poilievre speech at the Empire Club. The room is packed. It was the Arcadian Court, so smaller venue, but absolutely packed. And I'll tell you, from our perspective, on a Friday lunch, usually trying to find people to sit at a table of 10 is like pulling hen's teeth. And we had no problem filling that table with clients. So there is a great curiosity about what he has to say. So the way I look at it is he's gone from where you're texting with somebody or you're video chatting to now you're on that first date and you're having coffee or lunch and you're seeing whether or not I actually like this guy. Do I like the cut of this guy's jib? And he was not disappointing. Everyone walked away thinking, okay, that was okay. He stayed away from the crazy stuff. He tried to explain his thought process around the Bank of Canada printing money to the Bay Street crowd. And he just hit the home run on saying the things that they want to hear, which is things that Scott pointed out just a minute ago. So certainly for that group of people who are definitely the demographic 29 to 60 men between the ages of 29 and 60 and predominantly male. That was a great room for him. And that was a great response. And everyone in the room agreed with them. The one takeaway that I'm getting from all this economic discussion is and this may seem to be tangential, but I have no doubt in my mind that Mr. Trudeau is leading them into the next election after watching his speaking around the issues and after watching, especially on the Ford thing and appealing to the public on the Ford thing. I just can't imagine that he's not running, just the way he's presenting himself. So that being said, it's going to be between Justin and Pierre. And Pierre's out early talking about pocketbook issues. He's been talking about them for a long time. He's going to make the case that he understands you better than these guys understand. And then Chrystia Freeland kind of falls into this Disney Plus thing on the weekend. And it's going to be almost like it's a meme now. And it's going to be it's almost like when my friend Dave Dingwall said, I'm entitled to my entitlements. It's going to become a meme for conservatives. And it'll be an example of how out of touch these Trudeau Liberals really are. And I think Jagmeet Singh is taking the exact right approach, which is going after grocery stores, going after big corporate businesses that could be assumed to be having greedflation. And the conservatives are right along going like this. And they're saying, yeah, they're all buddies. They're all buddies. So it's going to be a long way to 2024.
Marine shipping is a large and growing source of greenhouse gas emissions. The volume of global freight is expected to triple by 2050. So, in response to more stringent environmental regulations, a global transition toward lower emissions shipping is now underway in the marine sector. 2 years ago, Canada welcomed the Secura Leader, the first trans-Pacific LNG-fueled vessel to arrive in the Port of Vancouver. The Secura Leader is one of the world's largest car and truck carriers, handling approximately 7,000 vehicles per voyage between Asia and North America. By using liquefied natural gas as its primary fuel source, and along with a modern hull design, this ship reduces its overall level of emissions, which contribute to climate change and affect air quality. Good stuff, to be sure. But the Secura Leader has to be fueled in Japan because Canada is currently unable to provide LNG as a marine fuel for transoceanic vessels. Ports in Long Beach, California and Tacoma, Washington are already providing LNG marine fuel, so Canada risks falling further behind. To attract modern vessels like the Secura Leader, Canada needs to have the infrastructure in place. Infrastructure like the Tilbury Marine Jetty. It would allow Canada to realize the economic and environmental benefits of this global transition to lower emission, more efficient shipping vessels. The final stage of the Tilbury Marine Jetty project's environmental assessment is ending soon. Canada should be saying yes to lower emission shipping by becoming part of the global network of LNG marine fuel providers. To find out more about our opportunity to improve air quality while reducing our climate emissions, visit talkingenergy.ca/LNG marine fuel. Hey, Jordan, what does a staffer do? What does a staffer do when their boss says the Disney Plus line? Do you just...
First,
do you want to run out and knock all the microphones off,
Yes,
or grab
absolutely.
the videotape, or
Speaking of Ronald Reagan, what did those men do when he was being shot at? They jumped in front of him. I would have leapt on the microphone. I would have acted like it was a grenade and said, "Everybody, clear the room."
Suddenly, you get an urgent call for your boss. Very urgent. Must end interview. Gotta go. Yeah, I mean, man, this is just I really want to like Chrystia Freeland. As a woman in politics, I do. I really want to like her. And I am trying hard, man, but it is tough. Stuff like this just contributes to the worst parts of her brand. So I hope that her team is urging her to just the off the cuff, most people don't live like you. That's the thing. Most people don't live like you. And I think that has not sunk in, which is too bad for her. But yeah, I mean... Yeah, I do feel for her staffers. That is a terrible feeling. You can hear it happen, and then you're like, oh, this is bad. So yeah, in terms of what everybody's saying, I think I agree broadly speaking with Scott and Lisa. The Liberals have said this is about saying we got the message on debt and spending, so we're gonna start to talk about a return to balance. Whether or not that's real is a separate thing. This to me was stay the course for the Liberals. I don't think that they, no big deviation there. It was interesting to see that they did use the opportunity to trot out some things to sort of match what the investments that are happening in the US, or, at least like relabel some of the things that are happening.
That was smart stuff in there. That was important and smart stuff in there.
I think you got to, there was demand for that coming from the business community. So this was a good moment to do it. I don't think there's anything close to the scale. Of course, it's not comparable, but they had to do something. And I think it's of course, it's no surprise that the middle-aged white guy business crowd would swipe right on Pierre Poilievre, which and that I think is a good venue for him. But I kind of love the fight that's shaping up, particularly seeing how Pierre Poilievre and how Jagmeet Singh are each tackling the affordability and the cost of living crisis. Like, it's presenting some really crisp and different options for Canadians. And I actually think that that's a good thing, broadly speaking, for voters and for our system. And as you said, yeah, the NDP, like, they've been very clear, like, they are taking a different tack. This is class war for them. They are going after corporations. They are going to be making the point that you can't count on any other party to do that. And I think what we're seeing with Singh right now, he's continuing what we saw him begin with the Bank of Canada. So going after the Bank of Canada in I think in a fairly restrained way, but doing it. That was a new move, and we're seeing them continue that. Obviously, they will be supporting the mini budget because, of course, there was nothing in there worth blowing up an agreement over, and they're going to hold out the hope of getting more concessions. So I think that their challenge on this was to have the space to be critical of what the government brought forward, but not too critical. And I think that they have managed to walk that.
Well, that's interesting. Can I just stop you and pick up on that quickly, because we're running out of time? And the one thing I would say is, if I was working with Singh, I'd want to see a little bit more anger out of him. Like, there are people that are really in bad straits right now, and they're his voters, or they ought to be his voters. And I did an interview for the Herle Burley on food insecurity last week. Like, people are having trouble putting food on the table. Like, this is a real, you could crusade about this. You could barnstorm church basements about this.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And maybe just to zoom back on how the NDP communications wise, it's a big temptation for New Democrats to crusade and barnstorm on that. And that is a happy place for many New Democrats. And I think that, people don't join the NDP because it's a quick path to power. They join because they believe in these things. And often our leaders do best when they are connecting passionately on these issues. But I think that there's sometimes a bit of a fine line on that. And if it tips over into sounding overly righteous, people tune out, and particularly the press gallery tunes out. So I think sometimes that's a tough line to walk for NDP leaders. They have to have that passion and they have to sound credible on it. But if they tip over into sanctimony, I think sometimes it doesn't work as well for them. So he has to find, and of course his own personal brand is very happy, right? He's a happy warrior, not unlike Jack Layton. He really, has a positive tilt to most of what he's doing. So I'm not sure that anger and outrage is his natural space quite so much as it would be for somebody like Tom Mulcair. And the important thing, I think, probably we would all agree for leaders, is to find their own voice on things like that. So I'll be interested to see how that develops for him.
Okay, listen, it's been a very lively show. Great conversation. I think it's time for Gordon Pinsent to bring it all to a conclusion.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
All right. Jordan, you got a Hey You today?
I do. My Hey You is going out to the parents of Ontario, a majority of whom saw, beyond the undeniably really tough aspects of disruption in the schools. There's no getting around that. That's very hard. People have used up their leave. Employers don't care anymore if your kids are home. A lot of people have jobs where they have to go in, but still a majority of parents saw through the nonsense of the Ford government, and shout out to you, because wow, that's a lot.
Lisa, you got a hey you for us today?
My hey you is to all those cadets and veterans and community people who stood outside on the weekend, although it was very nice here in Ontario, and were there to take donations for poppies, and still selling the poppy, and people are wearing them, and they, it culminates on Friday when we remember. And I think this year, specifically thinking about Ukraine and Russia and the reality of war, it's pretty close to home. So good for them. Good for them standing out there. It's not easy to stand in a uniform on the street corner, and that's what they were doing.
Cool. Scott?
Mine may be time stamped, and by the time this goes up, maybe it'll be out of relevance. But my hey you is to QP. You got Doug Ford driving his car fast in reverse. Don't get behind it, right? Please, for the love of Pete. I'm a parent as well as a political hack. The political hack tells me you've got to win, bank it. You can always reserve the right to restart legal strike action if that's what makes sense, and he appears to be acting in bad faith. But man, oh man, if you don't take advantage of this opportunity and you just say, no, we're squaring our jaws, it's not good enough, we need 4 other concessions from him, all of the advantages you've earned over the course of the past 4 days will come crashing down on top of you. And as a parent, I got 2 school-age kids in the Toronto District School Board. I want them in school, man. I'm a lousy parent. What they will do with their time from 9 to 3 if left in my hands would frighten you. So
Disney
please put them in. That's right. They'll be watching Moon Knight and She-Hulk. Even the finance minister of the country knows that shit. So come on. Get back to the table, reopen the schools, declare this win a win, and live to fight another day.
There you go.
Excellent. Very good advice. My hey you goes out to Ministers Freeland and Gould. I did an interview on the Herle Burley last week on food insecurity. This is a real issue in the country. Even before inflation, there were a lot of Canadians, a surprising number of Canadians, who don't have enough nutritious food to feed their families. My polling and other statistics have shown that this is going through the roof with the inflationary pressures on the cost of food. And there's now 1 in 4 people who list this as something they're very concerned about, whether or not they can do this. I think this is an ideal time to introduce a school food program that at least provides kids with one good meal a day that allows them to learn and develop and grow. So think about that. Thank you guys for being on the show today. Thank you, Lisa, for stepping in for Corey, and thanks all of you for being here. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsors, CN Rail, Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, Diabetes Canada, and Fortis BC, and everybody who watched or listened. Thanks for being here. We'll be back next week with more Curse of Politics.